Last year, we covered a lot about NPF4 and local development plans, the new ones which are currently being produced. And so we kept touching on policies relating to biodiversity and how they might be implemented. Nature networks were mentioned a lot because the concept is included in NPF4, it's defined in the glossary, and is in several policies with policy outcomes like strengthen nature networks, and nature networks are supported. They are mentioned in policies about considering how development proposals deliver biodiversity enhancement. And for major development proposals, local community benefits of nature networks also have to be considered. NPF4 also says that LDPs, local development plans, should facilitate the creation of nature networks. So quite a lot to think about. And given that the majority of the inquiries, the public inquiries that PD and APRS receive are about planning applications of one sort or another, or about LDPs, we very much wanted to approach nature networks from the point of view of the planning system and what community members need to know about them in order to usefully input to influence planning decisions or new LDPs, or to have the potential to improve nature networks via the planning system. So we know a lot of relevant information and guidance has been published in the last year, but it's quite a lot to digest and still growing. So we very much hope this session will help us all understand why nature networks matter, how they are developing, and how they might operate within the planning system. A great deal of work's been going on preparing to realise nature networks at both a national and a local level. And so we're really grateful that we've got 3 experts speaking tonight to bring us up to speed, all very involved with nature networks in different ways. Deborah Long from Scottish Environment Link, Christian Christodoulou-Davis from Nature Scot, and Alexandra Hoadley from City of Edinburgh Council. Thanks to you all for agreeing to come and do this for us. We're really grateful. The plan is we'll hear from Deborah first, followed by Christian, and then have a short comfort break, about 5 minutes, and then hear from Alexandra. And then, as Kat said, we should have about 10 minutes or so for questions, and do put them in the chat as we go along. If we don't get to any of them tonight, putting them in the chat means that we've got a record of them and we can come back to you afterwards if we can. So first off, we have got Deborah Long. Deborah, I don't know if you could, if Nina stops sharing her screen and you can share, that would be great. Dr. Deborah Long is Chief Officer of Scottish Environment Link. She's been there since, I think, 2019, and she previously worked for Plant Life and has a PhD in paleoecology, so is more than qualified to take the long view on biodiversity and landscape scale change. If anyone's not familiar with Scottish Environment Link, it's the forum for Scotland's voluntary environment community, has over 40 members and acts as the voice of Scotland's environment, supporting members to make change happen on the ground. Deborah's kindly agreed to give an overview of the importance of nature networks and links thinking on why they matter, and perhaps a bit of a strategic view of why a national nature network matters too, and what's needed to achieve that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nikki. You've saved me saying some of the stuff about my first slide, which is fabulous. I get to learn a lot of things very generally about a lot of different areas, but my speciality is very much ecology. And what I'm going to do today is give you an introduction really to nature networks, why we need them ecologically and how they can work ecologically, and then a bit of an oversight about what we're doing as a link network in order to make the most of the opportunities we've got for them coming forward. So I'm going to start with a bit of background. In terms of the policy background for nature networks, if we think way back to December 2022, at COP15, we had the Conference to the Parties on Biological Diversity, where the Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed. That's got 4 goals for 2050 and 23 action-orientated global goals for urgent action. So that's action that needs to happen over the current decade to 2030. And the good thing about this is that both the UK government and the Scottish government signed up to the framework. Of those 23 targets, there's one of particular interest to us here tonight, and that's the target to protect and have in place effective conservation and management of 30% of the Earth's land, ocean, coastal areas and inland waters by 2030. And we generally call that the 30 by 30 target. So when you hear people talk about 30 by 30, that's what they mean, 30% protected by 2030. And this target is being implemented through action on protected areas called OECMs and nature networks. And you'll hear more about how the action is being implemented from the other speakers. I'm here and I'm going to be talking about why we need to do it. So December 2022 was when the global biodiversity target was, the global biodiversity framework was agreed. What then happened was that in December 2024, the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy to 2045, sorry, there's an awful lot of dates in all of this, was published with its framework and its own delivery plan. And this is the document that outlines what the Scottish Government is going to do to get us in Scotland towards the global targets agreed in December 2022. It's worth noting that this is the third iteration of Scotland's biodiversity strategies. We've been working through these since 2004. But in all of that time, since 2004, we've not made the level of progress that we need, quite simply because it's not been seen as a big enough priority. And we know we've not been doing nearly enough because the State of Scotland's nature reports that are produced every 3 years are showing consistent declines in the distribution and abundance of key species groups across Scotland. The most recent report, just for a couple of examples, showed declines in lichens and bryophytes, invertebrates and seabirds. And I've got a link to the report at the end if you'd like to go and look it up yourself. So in order to make action on biodiversity a priority, we've got a new bill coming through Parliament this term called the Natural Environment Bill. And one of the things that will do, amongst many other things, is that it will set legally binding nature targets. And that's important because that gives the impetus to the action that we need to see on nature networks and other areas of work. At Link, we think this level of action is, we think the legislative targets are necessary in order to drive the level of action that we want to see and also to drive the level of investment that we need to see in the 5 years that we've got between now and 2030. And finally, just on this kind of introductory slide, you can find out all of this information about what we think the Natural Environment Bill needs to include is included in the Scotland Loves Nature campaign. That's a campaign run by all of our members. And again, the details for that will be at the end. So let's crack on with what's a nature network. It's not necessarily, or it's not just a physical green corridor like a river or a hedgerow. It's much more about ecological connectivity and enabling species to move through our landscape. So that could include and does include, they need to be able to breed, they need to be able to set seed, they need to be able to thrive. And the diagram I've got here is all of the elements of a nature network. So you've got core areas and buffer zones, and then between those you've got linear corridors, you've got landscape corridors, and then you've got stepping stone corridors. So these points on the map don't need to be physically linked, but they need to be linked ecologically so that seed can get from one area to another, for example, by wind or water. And why do we need them? So even though Scotland is world renowned for our landscapes and our wildlife, we're not doing very well when you start to look at a measure called our Biodiversity Intactness Index. And what this measures is it measures the health of our ecosystems. And you can see on this graph that it's actually very, very low. So if you look at this, you've got countries along the bottom and the arrows at the end indicate where the UK is. And you'll see at the bottom. So Scotland is the blue arrow. Wales is the red arrow. Northern Ireland is grey. England is brown. And then just to show you what the difference is, Sweden is the bright blue one on the far left. So when you look at where we are in relation to health and connectivity of our ecosystems in Scotland, we're right at the bottom. And that's why nature networks are really important. Now, what I'm going to do now is show you a film. This film we made in 2020 is an introduction. Some of you will know all of this stuff, but this film at least has some really lovely images and a lovely soundtrack, so you can listen to that anyway. But it sets a really good starting point for everyone. The other point I'll make about this film is that at the end, it points you to one of our web pages, which again was done in 2020, and we need to update that page. So by all means, have a look, but bear in mind, this is 2020.
We are all connected to Scotland's beautiful landscape, seascape, and wildlife. It's a relationship that makes us happier and healthier. But we're facing a crisis. Many of Scotland's habitats, plants and animals are in danger. There are causes we already know: pollution, chemicals, the climate emergency. But there's another big threat that we don't think about. The way we manage our land is driving our most precious species to collapse. Can you imagine trying to get to work or school if the roads and paths you relied on suddenly vanished? To save Scotland's wildlife, we need to fix how we connect to nature and how nature connects around us. Nature networks are key to restoring, creating and protecting the habitats our native species need to survive. Nature networks expand habitats and link them together so that wildlife can move from one area to another. Big or small, they reconnect our fragmented landscape. Nature networks work for our wildlife, for the planet, for all of us. Together, we can save Scotland's endangered landscape and wildlife by creating and restoring nature networks. But there's still a lot to be done. You can help. Find out how at scotlink.org.
So that was just to give you a very general description, really, much better than I could do in slides, as to what nature networks actually are. What I want to show you now is how a national network needs to work. So far we've got the global targets to which Scotland's signed up, and we've got the recently published biodiversity framework and delivery plans. And then we've got some key delivery mechanisms that Nikki mentioned earlier on. In order to meet 30 by 30, one of the key mechanisms is the National Planning Framework 4, with its Policy 3 that requires all national, major and EIA development proposals to enhance biodiversity, so it's in a demonstrably better state than before. It also has the commitment for every local authority to have a thriving network, which is brilliant. That's very, very good. But the problem we've got is that nature doesn't necessarily work within council boundaries. So for nature networks to work, they need to reach across council boundaries so that they can come together as a national network. Otherwise, they don't work as an ecological network. And what I've got here to show you, really, to show you this point, is an example from the Native Woodland Survey of Scotland. And if we zoom in, you'll see here that you've got where Stirlingshire, Perthshire and Argyll and Bute all meet. You've got Perthshire on the right, you've got Stirlingshire on the bottom left, and then you've got Argyll top right. And you can see there's lots of potential here to link up the fragments of native woodland, although there's no requirement or mechanism yet. So if we look at this bit here of Argyll and Bute, for example, if you've got birch woodland here and here, potentially birch seed could get north because of the wind. But lichens and bryophytes, for example, I'm a plant ecologist, that's why a lot of my examples are plants, they can't move that distance. So that's why where a national nature network that connects these fragments, or at least fills in the gaps through controlled grazing so that the birch woodland can spread in increments, or through created woodland so that the birch and the lichens and bryophytes can move in increments over years, that's an example of why we need a much more coordinated approach. This is just one habitat. I've chosen this because I've got a good map that I can share with you. But of course, we're not just talking about woodland here, we're talking about all the habitats. And if you look at the State of Nature report, you'll show that shows we need nature habitats across all of Scotland's key habitats, whether that's woodland, grassland, rivers, nature-friendly farming, whatever it is. The opportunity is massive, but we need to get on with it quickly. So, in terms of what do we need to do? I've pulled out 5 points really from some of the work we've been doing across the Link network of things that need to happen. The first one is that we do need government commitment to a national nature network. We've already got government commitment to having a nature network in local authority areas, but they need to link up so that we've got ecosystem health and connectivity. In order for that to work, we need support for local authorities to be able to work together. That means data, capacity, expertise, funding. I think it's fair to say that we've got mixed levels of enthusiasm at local government level, with some councils thinking that if they've got a B-Lines network, then they're fine, they've done nature networks. As I've just demonstrated, it needs to happen across all habitats. We can't just do it with one and then think we're done. However, if there was appropriate support, then councils could really smash this. The key to that is resource, it's funding and it's expertise. One of the really notable things that happened when the 2025 budget was announced was that local authorities opted to reallocate their funding that they had in place for nature restoration funding. And they wanted to use that to meet other shortfalls. That's not okay, because that's a short-term fix that just creates a massive, bigger future problem. 2 more quick points that I'd make is that regional land use frameworks, which are a key function of regional land use partnerships, which aren't yet achieving their potential, but again, they've got lots of potential. At the moment, these frameworks aren't required to integrate nature network needs. And that again is a bit of a lost opportunity, well, it's a big lost opportunity. If we can nature-proof those frameworks, we gain quickly and we gain strategically, and at the same time, we eliminate perverse actions along the way. Equally, those frameworks could be used to inform decisions around public spending at a regional level, for example, agricultural and forestry subsidies, as well as potentially the role of high integrity private finance. The final point on this slide is that planning authorities aren't yet equipped to be able to either inform or enforce decisions that accommodate nature networks. They need to be able to feed into wider land use priorities and inform them so that they can connect nature through networks. That requires mechanisms for local and regional input into where and how land use decisions are made. And at the moment, those mechanisms aren't necessarily there. The right action in the right place for maximum ecological benefits is much more likely to be achieved through coordination than through the piecemeal approach that we've currently got in operation at the moment. I said I'd share some resources, they're here, and then they'll be in the slides as they come round. So do feel free, it's just a few. And then I've also got some notes there on how to contact us if you'd like to. There you go.
Thank you, Deborah. Perfectly on time and lots of information. And yeah, everyone can see it's quite a complex thing. Great. Next, we've got Christian. Are you okay to share your screen, Christian? Oh yes, do put questions for Deborah in the chat and we'll come to them towards the end. Christian works at Nature Scot, based in Inverness, and his quite long job title is Project Manager, 30x30, and Nature Networks, Protected Areas, Innovation and Data Activity. Well, that's the long one I was given anyway. So he's part of the small team that has led Nature Scot's work on nature networks, alongside all those other things. And we're really pleased he's here to explain the background to nature networks, what's happened on implementation so far at the national level, what NPF4 says about nature networks, and what this might mean for LDPs and planning decisions in future. And he might also be able to give an idea of how local people could engage with nature networks in the planning system. So, Christian, over to you.
Thanks for that. Can you hear me, Nikki? And am I sharing the correct screen? I am. Fantastic. Yep. So hi everyone. I'm Christian Christodoulou Davies. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening. And I suppose I just want to also say thank you for all of you giving up your time in an evening to come to something like this as well. It can be quite a challenging thing, kind of working with environmental stuff, as I'm sure you're all aware. And I think it's stuff like this which kind of refills the kind of the hope container within me. So thank you for giving up the time. As Nikki kind of mentioned, I am just me, but there is a small team that I work with as well. So there is also a Nature Networks project officer that we have at Nature Scott called Sian Williams, who does a lot of the kind of work that I'll kind of be pointing towards. And then also across the organization, we have a kind of planning team, a supporting good development team who helps with planners, and we'll be helping with them with their LDPs. And we have operational staff as well. And all of those kind of staff should be on hand for be it local authorities or people trying to engage with this kind of stuff. So just to kind of make it clear that I'm obviously part of a kind of a bigger thing, and what I'm talking about is not just stuff that I'm up to. Let's see if I can jump forward a slide. Yeah, so just a brief overview of what I'm going to try and cover in my time slot, and I forgot to press start, and I'll do that now because I'll try and stay on time. So yeah, briefly talk about what are nature networks. There's going to be a slight amount of overlap here probably between me and what Deborah was talking about. Going back to the where have nature networks come from, what they might look like, how does planning take nature networks into account, what does the nature networks framework say should be done when we're kind of developing nature networks and implementing them, and then a little bit about nature networks and the local development plan process, because that's really the kind of key to this at the moment, and that is where we are currently at in Scotland when it comes to nature networks. So before I kick off, I just want to start with this, and I'm willing to admit, slightly ugly slide to try and illustrate what nature networks are. And I think it's important to do this, as I've realized that as I start talking around nature networks, it can start to sound confusing, but really at their core, it's a super simple idea. And looping back to this sometimes is helpful in keeping your kind of head above water when you're trying to wrap your head around nature networks and the stuff that's going on. So on this image, we've got a couple of areas that are already great for biodiversity, such as protected areas. That's those big green circles. We have a town or city shown in grey, and we also have some smaller areas, both in the town and city and nearby it, which are areas that have been identified as being locally important for biodiversity. So those could be local green spaces, they could be local nature reserves, they could be community woodlands, local nature conservation sites, etc. And the orange thread, which is tying all these together, is the nature network that we're hoping to see created across Scotland. So it's connecting together these important areas across the rural landscapes, reducing fragmentation of habitats. It's allowing these nationally and locally important areas to be more impactful than the kind of the sum of their parts, and deliver more for biodiversity, ecosystem services, health benefits for kind of people in our local communities. So the goal, the goal with nature networks is to get these fledgling nature networks mapped. So to get these orange threads actually mapped out across all the different local authorities in Scotland, and to make sure they work at that national scale as well. And then it's to encourage implementation so that along these routes, those green blobs that we have at the moment stay there, and that we get more of these green blobs appearing. So as Deborah was saying, it's not necessarily about having a uniform corridor the whole way along a nature network route, but we certainly should be looking to have more areas which are great for biodiversity along these kind of green threads. So that's nature networks at their most simple, and it's only marginally less attractive than the video that we just saw. So if you want to get into more detail as to what a nature network might look like, why it's needed, so on and so forth, then there is an in-depth framework for nature networks in Scotland that was finally published in 2024. But that was the actual work to kind of get that done occurred over to kind of 2023 through into very early 2024. And it was created using co-design. And so that framework was not written by Scottish Government or by Nature Scot. We just helped coordinate the process. And it had the input of over 200 people. They came from over 100 different organisations. That included community groups, as well as planning authorities. And it gives us this slightly more succinct definition of a nature network compared to the one I just gave you. And that is, a nature network connects together nature-rich sites, including restoration areas and other environmental projects, through a series of areas of suitable habitat, habitat corridors, and stepping stones. That framework, which is available on the Nature Scot website, also kind of gives us a vision of where we're trying to get to. Obviously, at the moment, we're at the starting blocks, I suppose. We've got those areas which are already great, but we know we're trying to get to a lot more. And so it's kind of useful to kind of paint out a vision. I won't read that off the screen, but there is a much larger vision within that. And that vision, once again, it was the kind of co-creators who helped bring together that vision as to what we were trying to get to in Scotland with nature networks. And then the final bit of the framework for now is the fact that it also does talk about the different scales at which we're expecting nature networks to operate, to work, to make sure that they deliver the benefits which are expected of them. And it talks about it from these kind of three scales. And so locally is that the local nature networks will be connecting people and communities to those nearby important areas for nature. It will be delivering local priorities, and that will be either local priorities as people see them, or if within an area you have a species or something which is particularly of interest, that's the time when you kind of really, at that local scale, will maybe thinking about that. Then we need to make sure, that we're thinking about nature networks in the regional sense, and that's kind of looking at those opportunities to deliver strategic connectivity and starting to build on those local ones to support national objectives and priorities. And that's going to need cross-boundary working. So from a nature point of view, local authority boundaries don't mean so much. And so we need to make sure that our local authorities and our planning authorities and the organisations that work with them are able to work regionally. And then finally, it needs to work nationally. So nature networks will need to connect together across all the administrative boundaries in Scotland and through strategic regional elements. And that's, thinking about the fact that we know as we have that kind of embedded amount of climate change, which is on the way, various species will be having to kind of move north or move south or whatever. And so it's really important that nature networks do work at that national scale as well. So really, one of the key things here is that in creating a national nature network across Scotland, we just need to make sure we don't accidentally become siloed or remain siloed within local authority boundaries, and always be looking for that landscape-centric approach and facilitating cooperation. So I launched off with what a nature network is, but it is just worth mentioning again where they've come from too. So the Scottish Government, as Deborah kind of mentioned, has its Scottish Biodiversity Strategy to 2045, which is all about aiming to address the biodiversity crisis in Scotland. From that biodiversity strategy, what we now have is the first published delivery plan, which is on how the ambitions within the strategy will be delivered. And that's covering the period 2024 to 2030. And this identifies a number of actions that need to be taken over that time period, as well as the key public bodies will be involved in their delivery and when they should be achieved by. And then on the bottom right here, you can see that for nature networks, there's a number of actions. And these make it clear that local authorities have a real leading role in the spatially defining and mapping of nature networks, and that's to be done by 2030. Nature Scot also have a role in this. We're also listed there. Nature Scot's role is much more in the kind of the supporting, and it was in the development of the framework. So we helped coordinate the development of the framework. Nature Scot also has helped put together a nature network toolbox to kind of help with all the various people who will be involved in nature networks. And I'll maybe touch on that again later. So what does a nature network actually mean in practice? So thinking back to those orange threads connecting together the elements in the landscape, it's perhaps clear that the individual connections within a nature network will often be seeking to achieve different things if we think about the fact that this is going to be going across the entirety of Scotland. And so whilst biodiversity will remain at the core for all those connections, there might be a different emphasis depending on what the connection, the setting it's within and what it's aiming to do. So at some point I will get this image turned into something clearer and more professional, but this is just my kind of non-artistic attempt at trying to show some of the different things a connection within a nature network might be aiming to achieve. So in the bottom left is kind of showing a nature network connection linking, from the rural to the peri-urban to the urban, which might be about green infrastructure, which might be about kind of making the most out of those green belts that we have, might be linking together local nature reserves to green spaces with schools, so on and so forth, doing stuff with regards to flooding or something. The next one up is kind of when we think about functional connectivity. So that example, for instance, of two birch woodlands, sometimes you might be trying to seek a functional connection between them. So you might say, well, we've got a great birch woodland here, we've got a great birch woodland here, and what we'd like to see is more birch woodland between the two. Sometimes you might be looking for structural kind of connectivity. And I've messed that up, sorry. Structural connectivity would be when you're trying to connect together two areas of the same habitat with more of the same habitat. And functional connectivity would be where it's not necessary to actually have exactly the same habitat running across the whole of a connection. It's about having something which is more nature friendly, more biodiversity friendly, little pockets, those stepping stones. And then there's kind of other types of connectivity as well. So when we're kind of thinking about nature networks, they are made up of lots of individual connections. And it's just, I suppose, being aware that not every single connection will be trying to do the same thing. So moving on to, I suppose, a more tangible thing. Here are some images from showing some of the great work that Moray Council are kind of doing with nature networks and how they are progressing with theirs. So the top left image is obviously showing the outline of Moray Council as a local authority boundary, and all the orange sites are those kind of nationally important sites. So those are those designated sites that we have, like European sites or SSSIs. So the first thing they've done is identified all of those sites to make sure they don't get forgotten about. And then the large image on the right is when they've started to look at what are locally important sites for them. So it's not saying the nature network is connecting only what's considered nationally important. It's important to think about what's locally important. So I think maybe that's locally important woodland sites, and there obviously is a second habitat there which they've looked at as well, which I'm afraid I can't remember what it is. But this is where local knowledge and local input is really important, because you can't decide on what's locally important unless you have that input. But that's kind of Moray Council's, an example of two of those layers. And then the bottom left inset is them mapping out some other policies. So I think this is their active travel network through Elgin, for instance. And it's another thing that I think it's important to recognize with nature networks is quite often they will overlap, or have the ability anyway to overlap with other policies. And it's kind of important to try and think sometimes about how they can overlap, so we kind of get the maximum benefits. Money is spent as wisely as possible, and it's just logical sometimes. Active Travel Network, non-surprisingly, has probably already tried to map what is a good way of connecting across a town or a city, so you can build on that. So that's an example of some of the early work that Moray have done. And there's a link there. They've got a whole story map where you can see where they've been going with their nature network. This is another one for Moray. And I really want to stress that this is a draft for comment, not an agreed element of their nature network. And so this is just a map that then shows how you might start connecting all those things together. And what a potential nature network corridor might look like. So on the orange line at the top is, I suppose, one part of their nature network, and that's probably connecting together two of those nationally important sites. And then what they're trying to do here is trying to investigate how you can have a spur coming off of that. So that nature network taking you into a more urban area and connecting together, and therefore safeguarding, I suppose, to a certain degree further those kind of areas that you have within the kind of urban realm, which already might be able to offer things for biodiversity. So at the moment, they might not be particularly great for biodiversity. They might be green spaces, but not biodiverse green spaces. But you start tying them in with nature networks, you start seeing that ability to be able to build on them and kind of take them further. And then this slide here is really just a reminder that the work that's going on in Scotland isn't purely occurring in Scotland. And so this is an example actually from down in England. This is showing their equivalent of nature networks, which are local nature recovery strategies. And so the smaller image, the purple, is showing, once again, around Bristol and the surrounding area. They have identified all those areas which they think are important for biodiversity. And then the larger image on the right is how they've started to create that network. And you can see that, for a network, it doesn't have to be uniform in what you're talking about as your kind of area where you'd like to see more great stuff happening. So sometimes if you're going through a very urban area, understandably, the network might be quite a slender thing. If you're going through kind of more rural areas, especially if it's less productive farmland, a connection might become a much wider thing, and you might increase your ambition even further as to what you're hoping to get out of it. It's a different situation in England, and it's probably worth mentioning that in England, the way that work has evolved is with legislation, and with legislation that stipulates the step-by-step way in which these local nature recovery strategies will be developed. And we don't have something quite as systematic in Scotland. So that's kind of why we have an emerging situation in Scotland where we have 32 local authorities and 2 planning authorities who could potentially approach this in different ways, through the framework and through the kind of support that certainly we would like to offer. We'll hope that it will be roughly the same approach that everyone takes across Scotland, but just to recognise that it is different in England. It's very prescribed. In Scotland, it's not so prescribed. Same work's also going on in Wales and going on in Northern Ireland. So that's how a nature network might look. And we know that the SBS delivery plan puts an ask on local authorities to lead on this. But I think now we'll go on to how does that fit into actually a local authority's work and its responsibilities. And that takes us back to, and I think Nikki was talking about it quite a lot at the beginning of this workshop, about National Planning Framework 4 and the way it guides local authorities to create their new local development plans, or LDPs. And that's the real driver for nature networks in local authority thinking, in their work, and in how we're going to make sure that nature networks become a thing in Scotland. They're not a policy in themselves. Nature networks aren't a policy in and of themselves within National Planning Framework 4, but a number of policies within National Planning Framework 4 rely on them to be delivered. So you wouldn't really be able to deliver the policies unless you have a nature network which has been spatially defined. And I think that's pretty clear when you start going into the policies. So policy 3 on the left and policy 4 on the right are the key ones, I suppose, with regards to nature networks. And it's been touched on earlier, but policy 3 talks about the fact how all developments will be contributing to the enhancement of biodiversity, including strengthening nature networks and the connections between them. As mentioned earlier, for kind of national or major developments, that commitment goes further still in the fact that it will be demonstrably enhanced for biodiversity, and once again that's including enhancing nature networks so they're in a better state than they were without intervention. And also it talks about the fact that any potential adverse impacts will need to take into account any kind of reversing biodiversity or kind of any biodiversity loss, and they will need to enhance nature networks to make sure that they're kind of keeping that resilience. So whilst it doesn't say that nature networks are out of bounds, nature networks are not the means to stop development. It is important that it has it in there, that if it's going to have that negative impact, that you have to then be looking at how you can enhance those nature networks to make sure that it's taken into account. Likewise, policy 4 is another biggie for nature networks. It's specifically around local development plans and talks about the fact that they will need to identify and protect kind of local, regional, and national, internationally important areas for kind of nature and biodiversity. And says that spatial strategies should seek to better connect nature-rich areas by establishing and growing nature networks to help protect and restore biodiversity. So I think it's super clear from those two policies within NPF4 the ask there on local authorities. Given the broad reach of nature networks, it's perhaps to be expected that they also feature in other policies. And for instance, up there, you kind of got policy 6 on forestry, which talks about the fact that local development plans should identify and protect existing woodland, and also look for the potential for its enhancement or expansion, including to expand nature networks. And then likewise, it goes on about links in nature networks with green belts as well as kind of being those existing areas that we should be looking at to help support and enhance nature networks. So how should a nature network be being designed and implemented? So it's great that we know the expectation is there, that these things will be mapped, but how should that actually be happening in practice in Scotland? So once again, going back to the Nature Network framework, which was commissioned by Scottish Government and outlines the principles by which it is expected that this work will be carried out in Scotland. There's principles across a number of key themes identified by the co-creators in the framework, which they felt were important. The important challenges that nature networks were going to face all became different themes within the framework, and therefore there's kind of principles associated with those different themes. But on screen now are those which are associated with the more relevant themes for kind of what we're discussing today. And so for governance and decision making, for instance, the principle is that the governance of nature networks will be transparent, democratic, and accountable, and with inclusive and diverse representation. And there will be a focus on empowering and equipping delivery partners from across sectors. And we kind of count local communities as a sector there. And if you go and read the section in that framework around that, it's very clear that local communities should be forming a part of that kind of governance and decision making. On theme 2 for participation, engagement, and communication, 3 principles there. Engagement with partnerships and communities will be inclusive, empowering, and facilitate bottom-up activities. So it has to be genuine. It's not just about engagement. It's actually about making sure that they're involved right from the beginning to be able to be the driving force for this kind of stuff. We should work on creating a simple and unifying message on nature networks across partners, with a focus on building people's connections with nature and fostering stewardship. And so once again, it comes back to the fact that this is only going to work if people are involved in it, and they understand that it is, it's theirs. And then there's this one: Scotland's public bodies will be exemplars supporting the delivery of nature networks on their land. And that could be, for instance, the school estates. There's a piece of work going on, for schools looking at their grounds to see how they can deliver for biodiversity. NHS Scotland are looking across all their estate to try and figure out how they can take it once again from being just a green space to a green space that's also a biodiverse space. As a local authority, often an owner of land, expectation there that they'll be looking at their land holdings to see how they can be showing how their land holdings can be delivering and contributing towards connectivity across the landscape. So the framework has backup, however, and that is in the form of this kind of local development plan guidance for local authorities on how they should be developing their local development plans. And within this guidance, it mentions the need for local authorities as they're developing their LDP to have a participation statement. And each planning authority is legally required to have one of these at the beginning of the process of preparing a new local development plan. And a participation statement is just a document setting out the plan for engagement in the plan making process, including when the consultation is likely to take place so people can be prepared for it, with whom they look to be engaging on, and how they're going to be doing it as well. And that should include the steps that will be taken to involve the public at large. So, it's not just wishful thinking. They have to be engaging when it comes to the development of this stuff. On screen now, it's just an example of one of the local authorities' participation statements. So Fife Council, they have a table. I've got a screenshot there of it, and the bottom left, it's a much larger table, which outlines the various stages in their local development plan, development and preparation, and the level and means of engagement that they plan to do at each of those stages. I think it's worth mentioning that at this point, most LAs have yet to finish writing their evidence report. So for most of them, that's where they're at in the process. So it still is quite early days, and the window of opportunity to get in at the beginning should be open to the vast majority of you, because not missed that window of opportunity yet. I think it's also worth noting that for this early part of it, the evidence report stage, many local authorities won't be going into much detail on their nature networks because there isn't the requirement on them to go into much detail at this stage. So it's a good chance that at this stage, your local authority might just be stating that it has an intention to make sure that they have a nature network implemented, and that's not something to worry about. That kind of is an acceptable level at this stage, but that's not to say you still can't try to seek to engage and make sure that it's on the radar, that part of the local community is looking to feed in when they start moving forwards with that. It's just at this very early stage of a local development plan, you don't have to have moved that far with your nature networks to get through a gate check, which is part of the system. I'm going to not get too planning because I have a sneaking suspicion most people in this room might be more expert than I am. Having said that, I will just quickly talk a little bit about potentially ways to engage with your kind of local authority and the LDP process. And I think there's a few kind of biggies there. And it was interesting seeing in the chat, we've got a lot of councillors in. So I'm glad I stuck councillors in down at the bottom, but not at the bottom. So the people on the local authority side who are going to be involved in that local development plan, quite obviously the planning department. So talking with them, if their participation statement isn't clear as far as you're concerned about when they are planning to consult specifically around nature networks, to try and kind of get information from them so you can understand when there might be the opportunity. For some local authorities, the way in which they're doing it is the planning authority has kind of somewhat passed off the nature network aspect to biodiversity officers, or kind of LBAP kind of officers, local biodiversity action plan officers, who will be working closely with the council, helping to develop it, and then it all kind of gets stitched in. So if you're in a local authority area where you've got biodiversity officers, it might be that you want to reach out and get in touch with them. Some local authorities are using third-party organisations, and I think a really good example of that would be the councils which come together to form part of this Glasgow Clyde Valley Green Network. So they're using the GCVGN to be the kind of driving force in trying to help design what their spatially defined nature network might look like, and that will then be the one that works regionally across the maybe 6 local authorities that make up that area. And it may well be that other local authorities look to come together when they're creating their nature network. And I think that's something that certainly we'd be very supportive of. If we think back to what we've been saying about the fact that nature's not so fussed about local authority boundaries, it's actually quite a good way to start off your work on this, so long as you are, once again, making sure that you've got that participatory aspect to it. And then the final one would be if you're struggling, and I think throughout this process of coming up with the framework and where we've got to so far, local authorities have been really keen on nature networks. But that's not to say that they are resourced amazingly. And so it can be hard sometimes to get traction and to get in there. And maybe I should have said at the beginning, as well as kind of my job with Nature Scot, I'm also the secretary for Friends of Merkinch Local Nature Reserve, which is a small charity where I live. And we are the ones who, the volunteers who help manage the green space near where I live. Sometimes we struggle to get the traction with our own council, and we found local councillors to be really helpful in just kind of helping make sure that our voice carries through. So I think it's a really useful one to remember, that your local councillors can be really powerful tools to help you. Going back to the toolbox, and I'm wrapping up because I realise I'm probably at my 30 minutes. It's just, so Nature Networks Toolbox, there is a live version, which is currently on the Nature Scot website. By the end of this financial year, so by the end of March, we should have a standalone website, because the idea is this is not a Nature Scot toolbox. This is a toolbox for everybody who's involved in nature networks. And it's just Nature Scott are taking on the role of hosting it and facilitating it. So if you are having a great time of it somewhere and you're finding that the participation and the kind of engagement you're getting from your local authority or nature networks is going really well, we'd absolutely love to hear about that, and we'd love to showcase it as a case study or something. Likewise, if you have any guidance which you think is really useful for people who want to engage on this stuff, we'd be really keen to signpost it from that toolbox. I don't have time, but I was going to reiterate again, it is simple. So try to always think back to this image and not find yourself getting too lost within this nature network stuff. And then I would just end with the kind of this Scotland as part of the High Ambition Coalition, going back to that global biodiversity framework where Scotland was really pushing for us to be as bold as possible. And I think nature networks are an absolutely brilliant time to really be bold. They're not forcing people to do something. They are about kind of encouraging investment and public and private finance into these areas where we can get great things happening for biodiversity. And so there is no harm in being as bold as we can with these things, and it can have really fantastic outcomes. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with Dundee, but this photo must be it must be a few years old, because now where all these children are standing is now a little forest, and they've all become trees, and it's absolutely fantastic. And that's a great example of an urban green space, which is now a biodiverse green space and is acting as one stepping stone through what is a very urban area. By mine, that's 29 minutes, 48 seconds. So that's not too shabby for me, because I'm really bad at timekeeping. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian. That was fantastic. Covered a massive amount. There are some really good questions in the chat already, which we'll come back to. But if everybody wants to have a quick 5-minute comfort break and come back at, say, about 4 minutes past 8, and we'll hear Alexandra on the more local aspect of nature networks. See you all in a few minutes.
Just to say to the person who's just entered the place, we're having a wee break. So that's why there's no one speaking. We're coming back in 2 minutes.
Okay. Hopefully everyone's back. I just need to check Alexandra's there. Yes. Are you okay to, Nina, can you stop sharing your screen and Alexandra could share hers? We'll get going.
Hopefully you can see that. It's the right screen.
That's brilliant. Yeah, Alexandra. Alexandra's a green space development officer at the City of Edinburgh Council. She joined the thriving green spaces team there as an ecologist in late 2022 and is part of the team working on the development of the Edinburgh Nature Network. And she's kindly agreed to talk to us about that and perhaps to give us an idea of how they work with local people.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me here today. So yes, I will be talking to you about how we developed and how we are now delivering our nature network here in Edinburgh. So what I'll do is I'll go back to day one, and don't worry, I'm not going into the slide in detail. This is just to let you know how we kicked off our work on the Edinburgh Nature Network. So this actually came about back in 2019 through a grant from the Future Parks Accelerator, or FPA programme. And this was a grant through Heritage Lottery Fund and the National Trust, which funded 8 councils. We were the only one in Scotland to essentially bring together a green space scheme to look at our green space in a long-term way. And if you look at the bottom right of the slide, you'll see there's an ecology section. And so that was key for this. That was where we started developing the Edinburgh Nature Network. And that was where our work kicked off. This was a collaborative team, both with ourselves at the City of Edinburgh Council and Thriving Green Spaces as the development team within Parks. But we also had colleagues based within this team who also were based at the Scottish Wildlife Trust as well. So it was a collaboration across these departments. And then with our nature network, we also worked closely with our biodiversity colleagues in planning as well. So in terms of the Edinburgh Nature Network, as I said, the development of this was kicked off in 2019. So it was one of Scotland's first nature networks. It is a long-term approach to manage, restore, and enhance the urban landscape of Edinburgh, highlighting opportunities to take action across the city using natural solutions to address the threats of biodiversity loss and climate change. And you can see a screenshot there of our online map of 200 plus actions. And one thing that's been quite interesting with our nature network is a lot of this started being developed ahead of NPF4 and some of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan we've been discussing being released, as it were, more recently. So it's been interesting to develop this, but then also make sure that we're still working very closely with policy, tying in with planning colleagues and working with policymakers as well as this is going forward too. So how were those 200 actions created? I'm saying we, it's a royal we. As Nikki said, I joined the team in 2022. So this is the fantastic work of colleagues working on this a few years ago. And essentially what they did was consolidate quantitative data. So this is GIS data on habitats, ecosystem services and opportunities, pulling this together with qualitative data. So all the stakeholder comments and feedback to bring together these actions. So in terms of habitats, that was 7 different habitats that were mapped across the city. So woodlands, wetlands, grasslands as example. Then in terms of ecosystem services, so the way that nature provides for us, the things that you would maybe immediately come to mind. This includes air pollution, this includes noise regulation. But as we've been discussing already, nature networks are also very much about connecting people to nature as well. So this included health and well-being, but also pollination services as well. And then, as we've been saying, engagement is key. So this was all ground truthed, and we brought in comments and opportunity areas from experts across the city. And so this was everything from local residents, working with local community groups and local organizations as well. So really bringing in all the knowledge of what we knew was happening there to create our map, our citywide site-specific actions, which will have benefits to both nature and people. So how do we go from a map of 200 brilliant actions to some spades in the ground and to start seeing our nature network delivered? So we chose the area of Leith to start delivering the actions of our nature network. For anyone that knows Edinburgh, this is up in the north of the city. It's got the highest population density in Edinburgh and also the highest demand for all ecosystem services from that mapping that I was just discussing there. So it really was an area to make a big amount of difference too. You can see from this screenshot here that there are green spaces in this area, but it's very fragmented by that city landscape. So it was all about connecting up green spaces in Leith, but again, very much nature networks are not just about council sites. It's looking at those we do own, such as the park in the middle, but working where it's listed as number 1, that's Leith Links, working very closely with other organizations as well. You can see a golf course to the bottom right there. We've been working with them on adding in wildflower meadows as a stepping stone, and then also working with the local community on sites they care for and look after as well. But it's also about our private space and anything else in between as well. There is a lot of complexity in urban areas as well. You have many different types of land ownership. There is the joy of utilities as well that can make tree planting quite complex too. And of course, we've got lots of different stakeholders as well. So it's really important that we do have engagement at all levels of the work we're doing, so that when we think about development work, it captures local needs as well as boosting biodiversity. And it also thinks of long-term care in terms of site stewardship and management as well. And one of the key pieces of work that we've been doing here is looking at developing plans for those parks you can see circled in pink there. We received some funding through Green Space Scotland. The fund was about naturalizing park management. So we put our nature network hats on and applied for this to redesign 6 smaller parks, which could do with a bit of love for both people and nature. You'll see a couple of photos later on, and essentially making sure that we co-designed these with the local community, bringing community vision to life while we created stepping stones that were needed in an urban area as well. And the other parks that you can see circled there, the ones in green already have master plans, and the ones in orange already have biodiversity initiatives in place. So again, it was thinking of that wider landscape and where we could start connecting this up on the land that we had. And it also gave us, mostly it was mostly it was revenue funding, to work with consultants, bring in landscape architects and redesign these parks. But it also allowed us to do a little bit of capital funding to kick off our Wilding These Spaces program as well. So this is a new City of Edinburgh Council program to engage schools with nature. It is coming out of our outdoor learning team, and the vision of this is that every single school in Edinburgh has a wild wee space that the pupils have co-designed, they've planted, and then they help take care of and do some monitoring on as well. So this capital funding helped us put the first one in at Leith Links, a local park, where primary schools mainly have kind of concrete areas outside, so we're giving them a bit of the park to manage there. You can see the before on the left, and in the middle here is the after, which hopefully you think looks better. So what we did for this quick win was plant a wildflower meadow with urban pollinator mix from Scotia Seeds, and also put in 10 native trees as well. And you can see that's us planting the first tree on the right as part of the funding announcement. And now there have been ongoing outdoor sessions to monitor and look after the site. And fantastically, there's actually now a permanent team based in outdoor learning seeing this project forward. So it's very exciting. There are more wild wee spaces across the city, and they're also a really key delivery partner of the nature network as well. And they deliver very holistically. They work with ourselves, they work with colleagues in flooding to really co-design everything. So they're thinking of kind of the big problems, thinking of them locally and driving it forward with the fantastic work of schools as well. So some of the example actions in Leith, I just thought I'd take you through as well. When I say we were looking to deliver these, what am I actually talking about? So many of these are connecting actions. So how can we connect some of those green spaces we saw in the photos? So for instance, we had Leith Links was the big one in the middle, connect it with one of the more biodiverse parks down south with green corridors. The way that we could do this is working with cemeteries, working as well with some of the local schools, and look at greening those areas as stepping stones. Another way was to connect another one of our LNRs with Leith Links as well. and create some pollinator habitat through the golf course. That's the action that we've already undertaken. And while this would also give some pollination services, as I've said, this would also give access to nature for the people in the area too. There's one action just to enhance lead links the park itself as well. It's a very big park, but mainly amenity grassland. So adding in hedging would give some important habitat, but also noise regulation as well. And then also, as I said, it's definitely not all about the council. So one of them is to work locally with the housing associations there and residents too, to enhance the land that they look after as well. And so part of our development work also looked at, yes, we have these 6 sites, but what are those corridors that are already connecting them up? We've also already had mentioned that active travel routes can be very important. So this was, can we look at greening those or protecting those that are already green? We also had, it's very important to think holistically and work across departments on delivering this. So the little pink circles you can see in the center there was an active travel project that was putting in planters. They worked with us to advise on what species would be great to enhance the nature network. So they weren't delivered by ourselves, but again, delivering those little stepping stones in an urban area. And you've got our numbered parks there that we were redesigning as well. And then you've also with the water droplets got where we used mapping to look at where we could also manage some water management in the area as well, and think of flooding and climate change going forward too. So again, it's really thinking holistically in terms of joining up these spaces. And in terms of engagement, as we were redesigning these parks, and also engagement and awareness about the nature network, when we were looking to redesign, we did online and in-person co-design workshops, and we also did multiple of these. So once we took that initial feedback on board, we went back with plans that we'd amended when we'd spoken to the local community. So again, we were really showing that this is bringing community vision to life while creating more biodiverse spaces. It's also very important for ourselves to make sure that engagement happens within the council. So as I said, I sit within parks, but it's very important that we're thinking long-term, making sure that these are spaces that look great in X years' time as well. So how will they be managed? Are we putting in interventions that can continue to be managed long-term by our operations? As I said, working with flooding, are there any areas they've got highlighted within their networks that we could be capturing in these parks too? We've got housing projects happening nearby. I've been working with them on their projects, and they've even used some of our suggested species in their green space improvements. So again, creating stepping stones, not just by us, and closely with forestry as well, and any tree management and plans as well. But it's also really making sure that we spread the word about nature networks, have it become something that is very clear when you hear what a nature network is, of how we're connecting up these habitats, what they are, and also showing that there's something that is robust and we want to thrive for years to come as well. So we've done some work creating some branding as well. And whilst this will go into our park signage, we also want this to be used by the community in the amazing interventions that they're doing as well. So if someone's putting up a great wildflower meadow in a front garden, that can use a sign as much as we would be looking to do it, to show the nature network has to be a collaboration. So I'm just going to show you a couple of the parks that we're taking forward. Hopefully you see the space and go, that could be a little bit more for people and a little bit more for nature. We've got a lot of amenity grass, but not much else. And this park is currently used more as a through route. So here are some of our concept designs that we were working on with the community and with the landscape architects. So essentially we were thinking, how could we add in some grassland meadow around the edge, some wildflower mix there, some shadier mixes underneath the trees, adding in some paths as well, because again, as I said, we're thinking of accessibility, how is everyone using this space, some social seating too, creating community spaces in this area, and some community planting beds as well, and some new trees, but also creating these stepping stone species which can still be managed going forward. And a lot of different things came out of these workshops in terms of people wanting artwork and local murals showing their local spaces. We've already spoken about accessibility, more seating, and even thinking about safety is very important. It's easy to think it'd be great to chuck in a hedgerow, but in an urban area, you want to make sure you're not creating kind of somewhere that's a shady area that maybe people don't feel is safe without those kind of sight lines as well. So there were lots of things that we were bearing in mind as we develop these spaces. And then we think about it going from the slightly sad picture I showed a couple of slides ago to a space that maybe you'd want to spend more time, people can hold more events, and is somewhere local people as well. There's a lot of flats in this area, very keen to be a friends group and take this forward. A quick snapshot of another park here as well, which actually has a great park network here. But again, you just think this could be so much more, and we could add so much biodiversity and colour and create a great gardening space for people here too, which is North Junction Street Park. So we want to take it from this to a much more greener, inviting space here. It's one place we're thinking of crown lifting trees, as it's actually very shaded at the moment. So how can we lighten it while still taking care of nature? How can we embrace the shadiness at the back and create bluebells, ferns, and some real colour and wooded aspects here, and more hedgerows? Again, more seating, creating performance spaces, and also thinking about wildflower meadows around the edge. So we are thinking about just creating these smaller stepping stone parks. These are quite small spaces, but people are very keen to see these local areas. These are the ones they walk through every day, and it can really make a difference to their nature network. So the next steps that we've got within Leith, we're starting with delivery of 3 of our 6 parks. This is due to funding that we have available and ways that we can prioritise taking these forward. Our capital funding, there's some important part of this was from the Nature Restoration Fund direct allocation. Many of the ways that we're taking this forward is through community events. So we're working with the conservation volunteers. So any wildflower meadows that will go in, they'll go in as part of a community event. Many of the people that attended our workshops were very keen to become a Friends of group of some of these parks. So again, we're very keen to make sure we help form these groups and do everything hand in hand with them. And we also have funding through the University of Edinburgh to hire someone from the Royal Caledonian Horticultural Society to do gardening groups for over a year as well. So as we create these spaces and as we run events, people will be learning gardening skills, ways that they would like to take forward and care for these spaces in the long term with us as well, and any skills they'd like to learn too and garden in these areas. And we're taking all of this forward in partnership with Edinburgh and Lothian's Green Space Trust and Groundswell, which is the team at the University of Edinburgh that I just mentioned. We're also thinking beyond the parks. So we're working with Keep Scotland Beautiful that are going to support us in setting up a neighbourhood group within Leith as well. We had some people come to us say, these plans are great. I don't live near one of these parks, but what I'm quoting someone here, there's a roundabout they really wanted to plant, or a verge they really wanted to plant, and they wanted to network with those other people in the areas. And so everyone could do it more together that well. So also thinking how we cascade out of these parks as well. And key learnings from this will also inform how we do this citywide and really make sure we have that long-term approach to everything as well. And we also currently have a Heritage Lottery Fund bid in to upscale this. So looking at how we take redesigning smaller parks and areas as stepping stones and doing this citywide. So this would upscale this to 4 areas across the city. And we'd be keen to continue our work on this and then make sure everything's done with partner organisations in the community and continue raising awareness for nature networks as well. And we're currently beyond the expression of interest stage for this bid. Now, monitoring is obviously very key to how we make sure that what we're doing is actually making a difference to the nature in our city. And we were very lucky to be working with the Scottish Wildlife Trust on this, who created our monitoring and evaluation framework, which is the next slide, which will cover society, nature and partnership metrics. Whilst Biodiversity Net Gain is not mandatory in Scotland yet, we did undertake the assessments for those 6 parks, and we did all have a gain, just as extra evidence to show that what we were doing would be making a difference there. And we also have a roadmap with our nature network to think long term, when will we be re-looking at our actions and further things to allow us to stock take throughout the process. How can we collate our habitat and species data? And then we also, the Scottish Wildlife Trust, set up a survey 123 form. So this is one of the links that will be sent through, but I can also send through after this talk. But essentially, how are we showing that these actions are being delivered? As I said, it's not all about ourselves here at the council. Many of these actions are being delivered by brilliant community members, but also organisations across the city. This is just a simple form that allows you to fill in who you are, shout about the brilliant work that you're doing. So we've done it with this people, we planted X trees here. And then essentially that will pop up on our map as one of the actions that's either in the process of or is being delivered. So this has just been set up and we're currently just inputting all the data. But again, it's something anyone can contribute to. And it's our way of showing all the brilliant work that's happening across the city and keeping track of the actions too. So this is the finalised version of the monitoring and evaluation framework created by Scottish Wildlife Trusts. Again, workshops and many people fed into this. This was again a very collaborative process. And again, it's very important that we feed into our local record centre and working with the Edinburgh Biodiversity Action Plan and colleagues as well on our long-term monitoring as part of this. But essentially, this just shows that we're thinking for our nature network in terms of society. So we've been working with the University of Edinburgh and that Groundswell team who are assessing how improving green space improves people's health and well-being. We've obviously got our nature metrics, some for habitat and some for biodiversity as well. And then also that partnership being very, very key. And just to say, I'm whizzing through it, but those sheaf slides will be shared so you can have a look through in your own time and get in touch with any questions as well. Now, in terms of policy and development as well, obviously, it's incredibly key that we align with our Edinburgh Biodiversity Action Plan, which I should say is celebrating its 25th year this year, which is very exciting, and also our planning colleagues as well, which is very key to delivering this and the policy requirements that are coming through. Also, as I said, aligning with the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy and the National Planning Framework as well, as all these have come out, making sure that our nature network is still fulfilling all the requirements that we needed. The Council has nature and climate emergencies declared. So again, this is a key way that we're delivering against this. And as you can see from the picture here, there are many different policies across Edinburgh that include biodiversity, climate, and improving our green spaces. And one of the ways we tie in across these is we have an internal working group at the Council called the Nature Recovery and Climate Adaptation Group. And that is essentially ourselves in parks, colleagues in planning, 20-minute neighbourhoods, flooding, and many more teams coming together to meet to make sure that we're all delivering together and the projects deliver holistically. And we're also very lucky in Edinburgh. We know that we're a large council, but that initial FPA project built awareness, and the work of fantastic colleagues across the council, such as our biodiversity team and others. All of this was really used as an advocacy tool in their work as well, which has unlocked funding. And we now have multiple permanent staff working towards nature at the council. So I'm one of 2 ecologists in my team. We have a second biodiversity officer as well, a nature coordinator that's pulling our strategies together, as well as that Wilding Me Spaces team. So this has really allowed us to drive forward that staff time that is needed when you want to push these projects forward, work in this way, and think about long-term management as well, and make sure that that's all tying together. So we've been very fortunate in that way. I thought that I would just finish with a couple of our initiatives and ways that we've been working with the community as well as across all of our estate. So one of these ways that we're responding to the nature emergency is doing grassland management on housing land. So this is training and investing in our staff, working with the University of Edinburgh Ecology team on the management practices and the monitoring of this, and building on a 10-year living landscape programme that's been doing this in parks already. And again, grassland management events with the conservation volunteers. And then finally, work on the Northern Brown Argus conservation. So this work has been developed through initial workshops with Historic Environment Scotland Rangers. Rock rose is the host plant for this rare butterfly, which is found in Holyrood Park or Arthur's Seat, as you may know it as well, but also found in our Pentland Hills Regional Park. And so we were developing where is suitable for stepping stones. We worked on this with ourselves in the council and in consultation with Butterfly Conservation and the rangers from Historic Environment Scotland as well. And we've created 2 stepping stone habitats, one on Carlton Hill and another at the Museum of Edinburgh as well, and working to develop further sites with our bereavement team and the World Heritage team and other parts too. So this just really highlights that partnership work is incredibly key in delivering this and looking at how we monitor this and looking at the next steps going forward as well. So whether it's planning ideas for interventions, planting, undertaking the action, the monitoring, the care, all of this has to be done in partnership with communities, with colleagues, with everyone, for our networks to work as well. And hopefully we'll have a few more case studies for you as the year progresses as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was amazing, very inspiring as to how much is going on in Edinburgh. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about it one day. We have quite a few really interesting questions in the chat. So if I can find them, they cover a whole range of things, from local place plans to how other local authorities could do what Edinburgh's doing, whether it will transport across the country. So maybe to kick off, there's a question about how communities could best express proposals for a nature network in local place plans, whether that would be effective. Is there any practical advice on drawing appropriate maps of areas to be included and how to justify wanting that to happen? Are any of the panel able to help on that?
I probably can't help, but and also, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to reply to any messages on the chat, so I'm just frantically copying questions onto a word sheet, and on that one, I certainly don't have an answer, but local placement plans have come up a few times now when talking about nature networks. So I'm just going to take an action away to talk with our supporting good development colleagues and see how quickly we can get a piece of guidance put onto the nature networks toolbox on how you can best link your input to local place plans with nature networks. And that's all I'm going to say, because I don't know enough about local place plans to say anything that will be helpful.
So that would be great. That would go on the Nature Networks toolbox on the Nature Scott website. Fantastic.
Yeah, I think we can get something up in a month.
Right. Super. Alexandra, is it something you've come across at all?
We haven't tied in directly through the local place plans, but I would be, I do believe that we've got information on our website about this, so I can find that link and make sure that it's shared. But that is something my colleagues in planning are well aware of, and they've made sure that we've got, that there's more work coming on this from ourselves here in Edinburgh. But I can make sure that I find that link so that can be shared.
Brilliant. If you send it to us, we'll pass it on. There's a question also from David. What if one's local area doesn't have great areas for biodiversity to connect them up in the first place? What's the starting point then? I think Alexandra kind of covered it for Leith in a way, that a lot of it is about enhancement. Whether that's coming through the planning system and planning developments at the moment, I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, from our side, many of our actions are categorized into sort of, some of them are connect, some of them restore, some of them protect. So those ones are underway if it's a designated site. But in terms of if you don't have them, we do have a lot of create ones as well, in terms of, you know, if you don't have, say, two amazing protected sites here and here, and how are you doing the corridor? I do think you can still, hopefully some of the photo shows start from what may just look like amenity grass and not much of interest, and whether it's even some of what we've been finding on housing land is even just leaving it and then monitoring the species you get and showing actually longer grass, what species might come through and things such as that. Or if you're thinking larger scale in terms of planting and hands-on interventions, I think you can definitely start creating things in the area, finding what other local groups are doing. And even if there may not be a designated site, still creating a very important habitat and site as well. And I've just had a quick look, and I will find the link, but my colleagues in planning do very much encourage people to get involved with local place plans as well as a good way in, but I'll make sure there's more on that coming too.
Great. And Deborah's got her hand up too.
I was just going to come in very briefly on the what if there's no biodiversity. There's always going to be biodiversity. If I just use my local village, and we've got a row of mature oak trees, and they're not particularly special oak trees, but they are oak trees and they're quite old. So therefore, they are an important part of the biodiversity. And then the point Alexandra was making as well, it's not just about designated or protected sites. It's about sites where you've got natural processes that are still happening. So even gardens, for example, have got really, really high biological diversity. They support a very high diversity of invertebrates. So even connecting your gardens, that still is worth doing, because it's still making a nature network and it's still embedding natural ecological processes that then are much more resilient to the ongoing climate change that we know is happening. So it's not just about protected areas, it's about whatever biodiversity we have, wherever we have it, just connecting it all. And sometimes that might seem mundane, but actually when you look at it from a nature's perspective, it's not mundane at all.
And just to build on that, just to go back to the kind of nature networks framework and the definition where it talks about connecting together stuff, it includes restoration areas. It was kind of a big topic of conversation as we were building that framework, that kind of concept of fairness when it comes to both nature networks and 30 by 30, that sister piece of work, that when you're kind of thinking about this, it's about not leaving any parts of Scotland behind. So there will be some areas which currently have less, and yeah, so restoration might have more of a role to play in those areas, but it's about identifying those areas where it is possible, be that vacant and derelict land or existing green spaces which aren't delivering as much as they can, or I think in the chat someone's talking about looking to get a community buyout of an area of land to be able to do stuff. So I think there's options.
Great. That's grand. There was another question from Kathy Pollard. How does Murray Council, I think this was an example, presumably other councils too, know or define what's locally important? I suppose there's a bit of an implication. Do they ask local people? But
Yeah, so I suppose I don't really want to speak for Murray Council there. What I would say is they are early on in the process, and certainly from the local authorities that I've been able to speak with quite a lot about their kind of process, which they're kind of going through, is for a lot of them, the way in which they're kind of seeing that they'll do it is they will do an initial shot at it. So do some initial thinking with kind of a certain level of engagement, and so Murray Council used a consultant. I don't know who the consultant reached out to. I think they did do some community events, or they certainly did some events to allow for engagement. But then it's to then take your drafts of nature network corridors, and then to make sure that those go back to the local communities, because you kind of recognize that your first draft is unlikely to be capturing everything that you might want it to capture. But the exact process that Murray Council were using, I don't know, but certainly that's from the councils I'm speaking with, some of them, that's the approach they're looking to take.
Great. I'm just looking through the chat. There's a question that I don't think has been covered. Actually, maybe Christian, you did touch on this perhaps, about examples of local authorities already working together to build nature networks. I think you Clyde Valley. Are there other ones already doing this to connect up across the country?
There is, yeah. So the nice and easy one is that Glasgow Clyde Valley Green Network, which I think is 6 different local authorities coming together to look at it. There's also been a coming together of a grouping of local authorities, I think Clacks, Falkirk and Stirling, and that's building on earlier work that they had been doing for a previous project years ago. And once again, they're kind of coming together as they're starting to think about their nature networks, to think about how they can be thinking about their nature networks all along that kind of fourth valley. I can't remember exactly what they call themselves, but that's another grouping of local authorities who are straight away starting to think about it like that. Also aware that Highland Council and Argyll and Bute Council have been doing a certain amount of talking to each other, including also a local community group, and so that is where Alliance for Scotland's rainforest, that kind of region they're working in. And when you're thinking about nature networks in that area, quite often what you're going to be doing is thinking about projects which are helping to restore, connect, improve Scotland's rainforest. And so certainly those two councils, being the two councils which are responsible for the vast majority, if not all, of the Scotland's rainforest, are coming together right from the off to start thinking about how they might have connections which kind of go across local authority boundaries. And I think bringing together those two councils was because of a local community group who wanted to see a project, and possibly with the help of someone within SE Link. So that's councils coming together, spurred by local communities and ENGOs.
Great. That's positive to hear. There is a question in the chat. I realise that we've slightly overrun, so maybe this will be the last one, and we'll try and answer any others that we've missed afterwards. But someone's asked about how do you engage people who just aren't interested in any of this in the first place. And I do wonder whether planning applications for developments in local areas is one way that people will get interested in this. In that, can something positive, biodiversity enhancement, strengthening nature networks, come out of development proposals? Is there a way of people getting involved with that? How do people go about trying to get biodiversity enhancement out of a development proposal?
I'm going to say something just because I don't like silence, but I'm not sure I can answer it. But so I think Alexandra kind of made reference to biodiversity net gain not being in place yet in Scotland, but obviously NPF4 does have that Scottish equivalent of biodiversity net gain, positive effects for biodiversity, which is being developed at the moment, and hopefully will be something which is in use sooner rather than later. But I think, and maybe there's some local authorities in the room who can speak with more authority, but I think some local authorities are already starting to look for that evidence of biodiversity net gain. Certainly some public bodies and private developers are starting to use the English metric up here whilst they're waiting for a Scottish equivalent to be made. But yeah, I think it's important that that gets pushed forward as quickly as possible. On the people who just aren't interested, I wish I knew the answer.
Same with everything, I guess.
One thing we have found in terms of people who just aren't interested, thinking at a kind of local level when we were developing the parks, is a lot of people still care about having lovely spaces near them. So even if we're accessing it from a different angle, for some people that's space to hold the events, for some people that's just having a much more pleasant place to walk your dog if you're on a lunch break and need a screen break or whatever it might be. And I think we were also very keen to make sure some of the areas we're working in are very high SIMD areas as well. So making sure we really are engaging with everyone in the area, maybe not just people that initially get engaged. We're also going to all the groups. We're working with a lot of fantastic youth groups as well, so that they can help design these spaces with us and they can help plan these for events as well. So I think even if nature isn't the way in for some people, with some of the work we've been doing in urban areas, everyone's looking forward to seeing the spaces still be better. And then sometimes you can then say, okay, this might look quite scruffy, but we've actually done some surveys and we saw X times more butterflies, and that's pretty cool. And it's a nice way to still see those ways improving. So I think that people still care about the spaces, but we may be coming at it from different ways as a maybe slightly wordy way to answer it.
Thank you. That's great. Well, can I just say thank you to all our speakers. It's been a really interesting evening. We're very grateful for you. And thank you to everybody who's turned out. I think Kat wanted to just say a couple of words to draw it to a close.
I was just going to say thank you so much to everybody for coming. We've only got one more in our series. I put the link in the chat, but also we'll be sending it out by email with all the other information, which will be a huge email. And just to put that date in your diary of the 22nd of March, so we can meet in person and have all those conversations we wished we could be having. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone and goodbye. If the speakers want to stay on for a wee debrief afterwards, feel free, but everyone else, go and enjoy your evening. Thank you much, Nikki and Claire, for organising this.